This is chapter 6, Deviance. I'm going to start out on slide 2, where I talk about the difference between the mainstream and sociological understanding of deviance. So throughout the rest of the semester, because I've already taught you kind of the idea that sociology tends to look at topics a little bit differently than the mainstream, I actually separate everything into the mainstream understanding versus the sociological understanding. Now, when it comes to deviance, there is actually something that is embedded in the mainstream understanding of it. That is when we hear the terms normal and deviant. Normal, in terms of the mainstream, people have a tendency to equate the word normal with what is right, what is moral, what is good. So if you flip that around, then the difference between normal and deviant is this understanding that whatever is deviant is somehow bad or immoral, that it is the wrong thing to do. So if you look at that type of definition, already you know there is judgment kind of inherent in that understanding of deviance. It goes back to that idea of ethnocentrism, where we have a tendency to think of, what we do as the normal and natural way. In terms of deviance, when you use the word normal in the mainstream, there's this tendency to think, well, it's good, right? Sociology takes a different approach to it, and you can actually think of it in terms of statistics rather than any moral judgment. That is, when you talk about the sociological understanding of the idea of normal, we're not necessarily saying it is better to be normal than it is to be deviant. Instead, with normal, you're looking at everything then kind of within this bell curve of what most people do, think, and understand. Okay. So if you look at normal as, most of the people kind of following within this, the idea of deviant no longer means, it's something bad, it is something that is immoral. Instead, it's anything outside of that mainstream norm. Okay. Now, when you do this, essentially what you're doing is saying there is no moral judgment in the concepts of normal and deviant. It is basically just saying, well, what the rest of the world is like and what the people outside that look like. So it does take the statistical understanding in that in terms of deviant in a sociological context, you're looking at any deviation from the norm. So I always use myself as an example, and you can say, well, are you deviant? Well, yes, from a sociological understanding, I am. The first then is, Asian Americans right now, still 5% of the US population. Just by being Asian American, then I'm outside of the mainstream. That if you're white, then it's 60% of the US population, then you would actually be considered part of the norm. Okay, so that is slide 2. Moving on to slide 3. Now this one's very dense, so I'm going to take a little bit more time on it, because what you're looking at then is the perspectives and approaches that you are putting towards this idea of the sociological understanding of deviance. Okay, so 2 of the perspectives of deviance that we are going to be working with are essentialist and constructionist. And I've talked about constructionism multiple times. Essentialism is basically the opposite of that, is what most people believe, and it really is cut out in black and white. Okay. So with the essentialist approach, like I said, it is the way most of us were taught, and in this they use what we call the normative approach to deviance. Okay. What does that mean? It actually looks at this idea that there is a judgment that is inherent in it. The argument then is that there is something obvious and inherent in an act, belief, or condition that makes it wrong, right? So the normative definition of deviance is that there is something inherent and obvious in an act, belief, or condition that makes it wrong. Now, if you ask an essentialist, well, then what makes it wrong? Then generally it is going to defer to authority figure beyond just you. So in a lot of cases, you are looking at a higher power in terms of who decides what is wrong or right. That is, if you're a Christian, then you would say, well, it's God. You look to the Bible to tell you what is right and wrong. Judaism, then also God, but then you would look at the Torah. If you are a Muslim, then it'd be Allah, and then you would actually look at the Quran. Okay, beyond higher power, the supernatural, then a lot of people cite the law. That is, it is against the law, therefore it is wrong. And in a lot of cases, people actually refer back to this idea of nature, saying, well, it's not the natural order of things, therefore it is wrong. Okay. Now what happens with this is, if you believe that, if you believe God put these laws in place, God put these rules in place, then what is considered wrong, what is considered deviant, would actually be just very consistent throughout every culture, okay? Every culture throughout time, because basically you are looking at the beginning of time and the end of time, and in every situation, that there's no exception to these rules, that instead they apply to everyone, regardless of whether they believe them or not. Now, what I argue is that an essentialist perspective is just completely ideologically incompatible with a constructionist approach, right? Because if you are saying, well, it is set in stone, it's not just for me, it is for everyone else, that is very much an absolutist kind of way of looking at things. So the constructionist approach, which we actually contrast with the essentialist approach, takes what we call a reactive definition of deviance. So reactive, you're looking at this idea of reaction, that when you look at deviance, you really have to look at the audience who is doing the judging. Okay, so with this reactive definition, okay, deviance lies within others' reactions to an act, belief, or condition. Okay. Deviance lies within others' reactions to an act, belief, or condition. Now, in this case, since it is in the reaction, the very same thing, right, the very same act, belief, or condition is going to be approved of by some people and disapproved of by others. So for a lot of people, they look at my face jewelry and they're like, oh, that looks really pretty, that looks really nice. To them, it's normal, right? To my mom, on the other hand, who kind of lectures me every time she sees my face, it's not normal. In fact, she basically thinks, Natasha should take all of that out. Constructionist approach allows for that, saying, well, some people are going to like it, some people are not. Now, when you look at deviance this way, what you see is that it varies. It's constantly changing. It changes throughout each culture. It changes throughout history, and it really does depend on the person who is being judged as deviant or not. What I argue when it comes to deviance, a lot of the clashes that we have in society, a lot of the culture wars that we have to do with people taking an essentialist approach versus a constructionist approach. Then an essentialist would say, well, this is what I believe, it applies to everybody else, therefore the laws need to reflect my belief system. If you are a constructionist, you're going to say, well, yes, this is my belief and that is your belief, and that's perfectly fine. We can have different belief systems. However, you don't have the right to dictate my life. I don't have the right to dictate everyone else's life. So you can kind of see how those two groups are not going to meet in the middle. Because if you believe something is right because, a higher power or law or whatever decided it, it's very different than saying, well, it kind of depends. Okay, so that's slide 3. Move on to slide 4, where I actually provide an example, an extended example on how this works. Okay, so I use the idea of sexual deviance, and you can actually explore the ideas of essentialism and constructionism in terms of sexual norms and deviance. So what you see is that most mainstream religions take an essentialist approach to sexuality. Okay, so because the religion actually prescribes an attitude of purity, and most religions do that, sexual acts are restricted to things that are completely functional, right? It's this idea that, okay, sex is bad because it is excess pleasure, and we actually need to make sure that we have regulations for it. What happens in this case is that sex actually serves a function, right? It's essential if you want to sustain a species. So what religion has done is put certain amount of restrictions on what is approved when it comes to sexual norms. Okay, and you guys already know these. It is kind of how American norms were basically put out there for sexuality until fairly recently in U.S. history. Okay, so essentially, what are the conditions in which sex is approved? The first is, well, in order for it to be functional, you have to be able to have a baby from it, because that is the idea in terms of the biological imperative and sustaining life. So to that end, it needs to be procreative, and there's only one form of sex that is actually approved of. It's heterosexual vaginal sex, right? Vaginal penetration, because you should be able to have a baby if you are having sex. And the third thing is, in pretty much all of the traditional religions, there is this understanding that you do have to be married as a man and a woman in order to have sex and have it not deemed deviant, right? So I've already picked on my undergrad institution quite a bit. So in this case, I am going to look at other religious forms, but you guys remember me showing you the sexual norm policy at the Southern Baptist University that I went to. Right? It was kind of stunning for a lot of you guys. So I'm actually going into a few more religious specific norms, and that is on slide 5. Okay. So Roman Catholicism, you're looking at, okay, you have to be married, it has to be heterosexual, all of the sex has to be procreative. What happens in that case is all of the forms of sex are disapproved of. If it's non-procreational, then it's not okay. So masturbation is not okay in the Roman Catholic Church. If you do masturbate, you're supposed to go to your priest, confess it, receive penance, etc. The other thing, which is fairly controversial, is that in the Roman Catholic Church, you are not supposed to use birth control. Because if you have sex and you're a heterosexual married couple and you use birth control, then there's no possibility, well, very little possibility, that there is going to be a baby that comes out of that act. Okay. So there's certain sects of Orthodox Judaism that actually dictate the same things, right? So marriage, heterosexual, procreational in nature, but to really make sure that it has to be procreational, then a man and a woman can't have sex for 2 weeks beginning at the start of a woman's period. So this is the time of the month that she's the least fertile. She's kind of deemed unclean at that point, and in order to resume sexual relations, has to go through what is known as a mikvah, M-I-K-V-A-H, which is a ritual bath. And it's only after that ritual bath that they can resume sexual relations. Okay. Now, certain sects of Islam then dictate man and woman cannot have sex during her period. Kind of falls in the same line as as Judaism, and you see a lot of parallels between these three religious attitudes, between what is approved of and what is not approved of in sex. Now, because religion is essentialist, these groups actually don't believe it just applies to them, it applies to everyone in the world. So what you can see already is sometimes there is a bias, and you guys saw it in my university that I went to as an undergrad, that they actually spell out that any homosexual sex is just not okay, not approved of, etc. Okay, so moving on to slide 6. we look instead at this constructionist viewpoint, which most of America subscribes to these days. So I wrote modern U.S. understanding of sexual norms. And you guys know this one, like it's been hammered into you over and over since the time you were probably in middle or high school. And the only thing that needs to be there in terms of modern sexual norms is there needs to be consent, right? This idea that, well, do whatever you want to as long as everyone consents, no one's coerced, everyone actually wants to do it, you're good to go, right? Now, the qualifications that are put on that are, well, in order to consent, you have to be of legal age. And that, I think that varies by state. I think in New York State, it's 17 years old. You can't be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Essentially, you have to be so sober and clear-minded in order to consent. You have to be mentally and intellectually capable of consent. And this last one, I shouldn't even have to say this. Like, no one should have to say this. But in order to give consent, you have to be conscious. Like, you have to be able to talk and say, yes, I give you consent. Remember when I was talking about taboos, this idea that necrophilia is one of our big taboos in society. It always blows my mind that people don't make having sex with an unconscious person just as horrible as necrophilia. Okay. So what you see in this case is that the lines are going to be pretty blurry between normal and deviant. That is, if you are a very religious person, you're going to have a very set understanding of what is okay and what is not. For everyone else, then it pretty much is, well, it depends on what you like, who you are, etc. In sociology, the idea of what is right versus what is wrong is dependent on the audience who is making the judgments, right? So, I'm always picking on my mom, but you can say the judgments that she makes as a very religious, Taiwanese immigrant in her, older years is going to be very different than her grandkids who were third generation Americans who have basically grown up in the 2000s exclusively. Okay. So what happens is consensual sex of any type is probably approved of by most Americans, because what we're finding now is that fewer and fewer Americans actually identify as religiously devout. But those who are religiously devout actually think that sex is appropriate within a really narrowly set of defined conditions, right? We had those three, and you add a couple of to them that are religiously specific. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here because I explained constructionist versus essentialist viewpoints of deviance. For part 2, I'm going to go over the different theories of deviance. And you guys already know that when it comes to theory, it's a little bit denser. So I'm going to break that into the second part.